Greetings, friends of liberty. 'Tis of course utterly unsurprising, when we look to both England and Spain, to see two very different countries. We English possess a remarkable liveliness at present, in industry, commerce, the arts, and sciences, well nigh unrivalled by any country on the continent, though I must say the Netherlands have managed almost to keep up, and even the French at times, despite their inveterate Gallic pretensions, do show signs of occasional vigour. However, when we turn further southwards, to the orange and olive groves of Spain, 'tis little exaggeration to say that is all we see. Oranges and olives, and of course some vineyards for sack. The Americans call it sherry, for which we are much thankful. But other than its vineyards and groves, that sprout quite naturally under the Iberian sun, Spain everywhere has been stagnating for much of the 18th century. The reasons are as plain to see as their orange groves. First, Spain's politics remain mired in the Middle Ages. Their Bourbon kings, apart from a late quasi-exception of Charles III, in their arrogance maintaining their well-nigh absolute monarchy, which of its very nature steels itself against the realization of Enlightenment ideals. Secondly, these Toreadors, along with their neighbors to the east, the Macaronis, represent the quintessence of papistry, and everywhere that the Pope reigns in men's hearts, he also rules their minds, and along with his inquisitorial methods, thereby damages multifarious institutions, with the press and science being muzzled by their torture racks for daring to think a single independent thought not approved by this devil's Peter. 'Tis not at all surprising, then, that political and religious tyranny proceed hand in hand together to the altar. 'Twas a blessed day indeed when Henry VIII, dissembler of ladies though he was, also cut in two our papal leading strings. Thirdly, of course, the Spanish countryside is filled with the landed estates of the hidalgos, ne'er-do-wells who live off the fat of their inheritance and rob the peasants so much they can. And that, in a nutshell, is our brief requiem for that ever more stagnant province of Europe called Spain. However, if we turn to the subject of stagnation in your own 21st century, we find a growing focus in the United States and elsewhere on the malaise, economic, political, and cultural, increasingly affecting various Western countries. In The Great Stagnation, How America Ate All the Low-Hanging Fruit of Modern History, Got Sick, and Will Eventually Get Better, Economist Tyler Cowen performs his own quasi-autopsy on the American economy, past and present, but nonetheless offers his blithe assurances that in the end all will be well. Dr. Cowen proceeds with his dissection in this tiny 89-page book by relying on 6 basic tools. Let's examine these and then see whether he's chosen the right instruments. Tool number 1. As he proclaims in the very beginning of the book, as well as in his title, America has, according to him, enjoyed lots of low-hanging economic fruit since at least the 17th century, and thus, having expected to have lots of low-hanging fruit forever, now finds itself having to climb higher up the tree to get it, or even perhaps needing to find other trees with fruit on them since this one has been stripped bare. Why does he say this as an explanation for stagnation? He says this because if you would imagine a graph of American GDP over its economic history, then the graph will go up like this in the beginning, but then when the stagnation comes, starting around the 70s, it starts to flatten out because annual GDP per capita is now increasing less. So what do you get? A curve with a bump, or a hump if you prefer. This hump Cowen designates as the low-hanging fruit that America took advantage of, the hump. But as anyone can see, the problem with this analogy is that if the flattening of the curve is due to some other cause, like the government controlling the economy and the society more and more from the 60s or 70s onwards, exactly as it did, thus flattening the curve because of that reduced productivity, then the hump isn't explained by the middle of the graph, but instead by the lack of productivity at the end. But what Tyler does is to point at the hump and proclaim, see, that was low-hanging fruit. What specific factors does he claim caused the hump in the middle? He says free land, lots of immigrant labor, and powerful new technologies. Let's examine these three. First, whether bought or stolen, if that land makes your economy bigger, it doesn't make it more productive per capita, which is what happened. That has to be explained by something else. Maybe because all those people in the land were freer than they were in most other European countries from whence they came. Secondly, immigrant labor. Immigrant labor can make an economy bigger, but again, by itself can't make it more productive per capita unless it's also free. It also begs the question as to why so many immigrants chose to come to America and not to other countries in the first place. And remember all those immigrants from Europe who settled in New York, which at one point was the most densely settled city in human history? Did they come for the land, Dr. Cowen? Or the amenities on the Lower East Side? No, they came because America was freer. Thirdly, he says powerful new technologies. That was allegedly another element of the hump. But this is obviously false because the new technologies, aside from what America copied from English textile manufacturers in the first half of the 19th century, weren't like fruit, which can just be plucked, but instead was largely created by them, invented. Do I need to list all the American inventions and innovations of the 19th and 20th centuries? If those were low-hanging fruit, the Indians who lived here for millennia surely would have plucked them long ago. Did they, Dr. Cowen? Instead, that produce was from fruit from trees that had been deliberately cultivated by Americans and then harvested. The phonograph, the wireless, the telephone, the airplane, the mass production of automobiles, the light bulb, and thousands of other inventions and innovations in every field of human endeavor. Low-hanging fruit, what a bizarre analogy to explain this enormous self-created tidal wave of human industry and intelligence, one of the greatest in world history. Did the Americans just pluck telephones and Cessnas right off the branches of the California redwoods? Because they had big, long ladders that the Indians didn't, Tyler? We can also point out that the economy of Hong Kong exploded from 1960 to 2017 before being stifled by the policies of the CCP. But Hong Kong didn't have any land. It's just a big rock with a natural harbor. Nonetheless, it was enormously prosperous just because of its freedom. Wasn't America free too, Dr. Cowen, before the 60s and 70s? And the Industrial Revolution in England, did it occur because we English suddenly got more land? We added it onto Land's End and John O'Groats? Or had a huge wave of French, Spanish, and Italian migrants? Couldn't have been simply because we English were significantly freer than the French, Spanish, and Italians, could it, Tyler? After these three attempted reasons, he also adds additional fruits. This is a multi-fruit tree. So he says, fourthly, in 1900, only 6.4% of Americans of the appropriate age group graduated from high school. By 1960, 60% of Americans were graduating from high school, almost 10 times the rate of only 60 years earlier. So he's implying that this transition to getting more education in general was yet another type of low-hanging fruit that has in the 21st century now essentially stopped. Is this an example of low-hanging fruit? No. Since the American economy at this time was free, the number of kids going to high school and college was optimal because farm machinery wasn't very productive, so America still needed to have lots of farmers. Because B, the knowledge in higher education wasn't that developed, so there wasn't that much to get. And C, because many people, like the Wright brothers, didn't need college to learn. In their case, creating one of the greatest inventions ever on their own in their own lab and wind tunnel. The problem now is not that the number of kids going to school is plateaued, but instead that the rate of valuable new inventions and innovations that Americans used to discover, just like those of the Wright brothers and many others, has slowed. So, for example, instead of young American scientists developing the enormous potential of nanotechnology and nuclear energy and genetic engineering to revolutionize the world in a way that could even make the Industrial Revolution look like child's play, the creation and development of that new knowledge is being retarded by the stifling control of the American government and regulatory agencies, together with the monopoly of American higher education and its publicly funded and subsidized science. Fifthly, and finally, with regard to specific low-hanging historical American fruits, he mentions catch-up growth, giving as an example the growth that China has had when it partly grew so rapidly from the 1980s on because it used or copied the intellectual property of other countries. The problem here is that this didn't happen very long in America, since again, by the latter half of the 19th century, America was becoming a world leader in technology. So this alleged fruit turns out to be historically very distant and minuscule. America had about a century of world-leading pioneering growth before it started stagnating. Now let's proceed to his second technique of analysis, tool number 2, description. He says, for example, that A, apart from the seemingly magical internet, life in broad material terms isn't so different from what it was in 1953. True. B, he says, about 1/3 of the college students today will drop out, a marked rise since the 1960s when the figure was only 1 in 5. True. C, he says, in 1947, median family income was $21,771. By 1973, a mere 26 years later, it was more than twice higher at $44,381. But in 2004, it had only gone up to $54,061, which is less than a 22% increase. True. D, he says, growth rates are lower today than before 1973, no matter what exact numbers you settle on for the absolute living standard. True. E, he says, the United States spends a much higher percentage of its GDP on medical services than any other country in the world, yet American health outcomes are not obviously superior to those of other wealthy countries. True. He says robotics, artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, all these areas where the progress has been a lot more limited than people think. True. And finally, H, he quotes a passage saying that in 2009, the average reading score for 17-year-olds was not significantly different from that in 1971, despite the fact that spending for this age group has vastly increased. So, with all these examples, what he's doing is describing stagnation, but not explaining it. So maybe he gets half credit here, but describing is not explaining. On to tools numbers 3 and 4. Number 3, being agnostic about whether big government is bad, and number 4, being apparently against big government. Here he plays it ambiguously on the one hand. Tool number 3, he says specifically, agnostically, that the proper role of government in society is beyond the scope of this discussion, and the larger the percentage of government consumption in the economy, the harder it is to tell exactly how well we are doing in real economic growth and living standards. No. Increased
rights-violating government is always a negative. And it's the only point of this whole discussion because it's the overwhelming reason why America is stagnating. For example, American education was much freer before World War II, with no K-12 Department of Education created by Jimmy Carter in 1980, and no subsidies to higher ed for kids to go to college. It was thus much freer and much more productive per dollar spent. And this he actually briefly alludes to in K-12. In higher education, as I've discussed in many videos on this channel, the vast subsidies and governmental monies given to higher ed has resulted in the growth of many highly destructive ideologies, such as the trans movement, the racism of critical race theory, the proliferation of green extremism among the young, the growth of fat and disability studies, and hardcore man-hating feminism. All these ideologies and the intellectual, cultural, and scientific stagnation and harm they've brought are caused by the increased governmental funding and control over education, which intellectual harm remain entirely unmentioned by our author. Similarly, one likely reason that American obesity rates shot up starting in the 1980s was because the controlling American governmental agency, the FDA, started deliberately promoting eating lots of carbs and denigrating eating foods with normal amounts of fat. Nina Teicholz wrote a whole best-selling and award-winning book about this disaster called Big Fat Surprise. So Tyler typically doesn't mention this role of government. He just mentions the greatly increased healthcare spending. But using tool number 4 in a vague, middle-of-the-road way, he does, at times, mention the increased governmental role in American society and imply, sort of, it's not good. And so he says, most of what we spend on education is dominated by government, so our educational spending is not facing a strong market test. Or he says, government, consumption spending, education spending, and healthcare spending are sectors where there is massive government distortion of incentives. Or he criticizes liberal economist Paul Krugman implicitly, saying Krugman wants to mimic some very particular features of the 1950s: high marginal tax rates, high rates of unionization, and a relatively egalitarian distribution of income and wealth. Or he says, for the last 40 years, most Americans have been expecting more than their government is capable of delivering. That mistake is at the root of why our government is functioning poorly. Tool number 5. He criticizes tax cuts, saying tax cuts without spending cuts simply do not work, and yet politicians are driven to market them repeatedly. Not true. The reality is that when you cut taxes, you give people some of their money back, which in this era of big government, they deserve no matter what comes next. Secondly, you increase the pressure on politicians not to live beyond their budgetary means. But if they nonetheless do engage in deficit spending, it would have been more if taxes hadn't been cut. Finally, tool number 6. He implies that the growth of government is not due to the ideology of progressivism and big government that swept Western civilization at the beginning of the 20th century and beyond, resulting in America in the Red Decade and New Deal in the 30s, and in many socialistic, fascistic, and communistic governments. No, he says that this enormous growth of government occurred simply and only because Western civilization greatly increased its transportation and communication capabilities. Assume we had no cars, no trucks, no planes, no telephones, no TV or radio, and no rail network. Of course, we would all be much poorer. But how large could government be? This point ignores 2 factors. First, historically, government changed after the ideology changed. And B, thus, capability is not the only factor involved. Most football players, for example, are physically capable of murdering people as brutally as O.J. Simpson did, but they don't use that capability. Similarly, a simple check of the Heritage Index of Economic Freedoms shows that some countries historically, like Hong Kong, Switzerland, and Singapore, have been much freer, even though living in the modern era with all these transportation and communication capabilities. Or we could point out that in 1925, Soviet Russia had much less transportation and communication capabilities than the U.S. did, but was much more oppressive. So again, capability is only one small factor. The largest is the philosophy and ideology of a country. So that about wraps up this superficial attempt by Tyler Cowen. I would give it a C-D+. Let's briefly list his major tools of dissection again, and then a recommendation for a much better book on the causes of American stagnation. Tool number 1. His fundamental explanation that America picked a lot of low-hanging fruit historically is utterly false. The bump in the curve is caused by the flattening of the curve at the end, not the apparent bump in the middle, which would disappear if the curve kept going up. Tool number 2. He constantly describes American stagnation, implying that he's explaining it, which he's not. Tools number 3 and 4. He presents himself first as an agnostic on whether big government can work, but then at times also seems to imply that greatly increased government spending has resulted in a loss of productivity. And finally, tools 5 and 6. He's against tax cuts and completely misunderstands the dominant role of ideologies in causing the present stagnation of Western civilization. What book would I recommend instead, in its place? The brilliant Where is My Flying Car? By the computer scientist and genuine libertarian J. Storrs Hall, which you can download from Amazon. Where is My Flying Car is enormously detailed, explaining how the potential growth of American technological and scientific progress has been stifled time and again since the 70s by big government. Very happy for my part to be living in late 18th century England, where we understand that the greatest antidote to economic and cultural stagnation is freedom. I bid you well, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.